Okay, this screencast is going to begin with the pull factors attributing to the Great Migration. So many of you have already gotten through chapter 21, so you can at this point fast forward to the beginning of chapter 22. So during World War I, there are some changes happening that are going to create and generate pull factors, kind of encouraging migration out of the South into the North. One is a shrinking labor supply. Part of this is because immigration numbers are going to begin to drop in the 19-teens. Just for example, like you see on the screen, in 1914, 1.2 million European immigrants came into the U.S., and by 1915, that number, dropped over 700,000 less than the prior year. So because there's fewer immigrants coming in to the North and into the United States, that would leave more job opportunities open for African Americans to take. And then also with World War I, you have the draft, so we have large numbers of men being sent overseas to fight, which also vacates their jobs. In terms of the labor sources available, really we have women, African Americans, and other minority groups, so truly the American economy will kind of depend on African Americans to fill some of these jobs during the war. This is a picture of a black factory worker. Okay, is the North the promised land? Are things going to be much improved for African Americans who do relocate out of the South during this period? There are some positives. They are able to participate in politics without all the violence they were experiencing in the South. They did participate in black churches, social groups. So overall, conditions are improved compared to how they were in the South. But truthfully, there are some ways the promised land, the North, falls short in terms of giving African Americans an equal seat at the table. White workers do not have a positive response to black workers at this time, and that is going to also lead to additional racial conflict in northern cities, more so than it had existed prior to the Great Migration. Cities like Chicago, St. Louis experienced a lot of conflict. This kind of shows y'all these pictures, some newspaper posts of different instances of African Americans being killed or beat in the city of St. Louis, east side of St. Louis. On the left, you see that the death tolls nearly reached 250. This is a protest happening in an urban city in which the sign in the front is reading, "The first blood for American independence was shed by a Negro, Crispus Attucks." If you remember that name, you learned about him in the beginning of the American Revolution. He is one of the first individuals killed in the Boston Massacre, and he was a fugitive slave. So they're referencing the fact that, black men, women have been killed for the cause of freedom since the beginning of this country's history. Just another example of how how the North is not living up to its hype for the African Americans. There were really poor housing conditions in the North, dilapidated buildings, old buildings. You had discriminatory housing markets, meaning that houses were not sold to blacks in certain parts of certain cities, including, the city of Chicago. You see a huge spike in the south side of Chicago's black population, over 50,000, within a 10-year period. And that's a reflection of how the housing market was pretty unfair at this time. Okay, so what you need to do now is pause and go download the chapter 22 outline if you haven't done so already, as that is going to be what we start now. Okay, and I'm just going to get through a good introduction of the 1920s today, and then we'll save some stuff for in class. So the first thing I want to kind of just touch on is modern America. In terms of the U.S. on the global stage, in the decades after World War One, the spread of new technologies increased the United States' engagement with the world. Business became more international than it ever had been before. We're more involved in international global economies, global markets. People around the globe are starting to buy more and more American products. They're listening to American music. They're watching American movies. So we are very much becoming more modern on a global front in the years following World War One. In terms of our economic productivity, I think one invention that kind of categorizes the era is the invention of the Model T. The growth of the automobile has a big effect on, the United States society as a whole. Henry Ford is obviously the inventor of the Model T. He adopts mass production techniques such as the assembly line that allows him to manufacture this vehicle more efficiently and cheaply than ever before. Thus, it's going to be able to be sold for a cheaper rate than previous automobiles or methods of transportation. The 20s is definitely an era in which mass entertainment is kind of on the rise. I'd say the radio is probably one of the first forms of popular entertainment and popular communication, allowing listeners, just to have easy access to info, and music, obviously, being able to listen to music around the world. I mean, there's stories of, Paris being able to play American jazz, because of the radio. So just that kind of method of globalizing music and entertainment. Also movies, by the end of the decade, movies are a huge industry. The textbook for the course says that they are the 5th largest industry in the nation by the end of the 1920s. The Jazz Singer is a very prominent film in the 20s. It was actually the first film with sound in it instead of being a silent film. We call those types of films talkies. Spectator sports are also popular and another example of mass entertainment. I think there's an unparalleled interest in sports kind of skyrocketing in the 20s, and some of those sports are, baseball and predominantly football. Advertising is going to grow significantly in the 1920s, and mass consumption will drive the U.S. economy. We see ads aiming to show Americans how certain products could, help them with their social standing, help them feel more prominent in society. So you'd have celebrities, endorse certain products, posters, newspaper ads, radio commercials. We just see kind of mass consumption taking a turn in this time. The next topic we're going to talk about is Prohibition. And Prohibition is going to be established with the 18th Amendment, which is going to prohibit the manufacture, the sale, the consumption of alcohol in the United States. Because it's prohibiting alcohol, that's why we call it Prohibition. Causes of Prohibition, reformers during the teens and early 20s really consider alcohol kind of a main issue in society, the primary cause of certain corruption, crime, abuse, accidents at work. And, some religious groups even think it's sinful. So reformers just believe that if alcohol is banned, it would kind of clean up society in a way, okay? The truth is that the people supporting Prohibition are not in the cities. They are in the more isolated rural areas of America, but it's going to be the cities in which people oppose the idea of Prohibition and try to break the law and get around the rules. Because let's just be honest, Prohibition was very, very hard to enforce. I mean, it's very hard to enforce that no Americans are consuming alcohol. There's a lot of Americans, and there's really not enough people to be able to monitor this activity. Not enough money was budgeted for this cause. So, really just an impossible task. What we see developing really quickly in the cities are places called speakeasies, which were essentially hidden bars and clubs that would distribute and sell alcohol or liquor illegally. And they were called speakeasies because you were, supposed to speak quietly, softly to avoid detection, kind of keep it on the DL. Okay, so these bars would not just be in the middle of a street, they would be in the back of an office building. They would be where people wouldn't really expect them to be. And they were very popular, especially, in the mid and upper class. So you have a lot of people attending speakeasies in the cities, breaking the law with the Prohibition era, or within the Prohibition era. You do also have people, basically ignoring the law and, distilling their own alcohol in their backyard and making their own alcohol anyway. You also have crime kind of coming out of this era, because when something's illegal and it's hard to find, but it's high in demand, people can make a lot of money off that. And a group of people called bootleggers are going to tap into that very quickly. Bootleggers are the sellers of illegal alcohol. They're basically smuggling alcohol from, out of the country into the cities and distributing them into clubs. And they're making lots and lots of money off of that industry. Now, the thing is that this is going to lead to organized crime, because different groups and different individuals would compete for, economic control of a certain city. They wanted to be the main distributor of the alcohol and make all the profits. So this is kind of where people like Al Capone really make a name for themselves. Because whenever two groups were in competition, often violence would ensue, and murders, such as the Valentine's Day Massacre. So, that's kind of a connection to, Al Capone and, the illegal practice of prohibition, or within prohibition, sorry. Eventually, prohibition does come to an end, just because it's really unpopular by the end of the 1920s. I mean, in the beginning, during kind of on the tail end of the progressive era, it was pretty popular, but by the end of the 1920s, less than 20% of Americans were said to support it. So, it'll eventually get repealed with the passing of the 21st Amendment, which officially kind of X's out and voids the 18th. The last thing we'll talk about today is the 20s woman. Lots of changes happening for women in the 1920s. It was a rebellious period for women. They're beginning to assert and demand their independence. They're rejecting kind of more traditional values. And of course, the woman of the 20s is characterized as a flapper. A flapper is defined as an emancipated young woman who is kind of just embracing the social changes and fashions of the era. So we're seeing the dresses become a little shorter, but also very loose-fitting. We're seeing the haircuts shorter, beads, as accessories, heels for shoes. That's just a few of the fashion changes. But overall, to be a flapper was more of an attitude thing, being a little bit more assertive in public, not being afraid to go out with your friends, and not need, an escort. And, there's a bit of a double standard emerging, because even though women are starting to express a little bit more freedom, even with dating, for example, it's still deemed at this point more socially acceptable for a man to engage in some of those types of freedoms. But they are having fun, and it is a step in, liberalizing their their social expectations. All right, we're going to stop here for today. I will continue this on Monday.